I always liked canoes, and figured that was just me, so it's very encouraging to see that the Antique Boat Museum and all of you are apparently also interested in canoes, so nice to know. And let me also qualify this by saying that this is about why canoes in the Old Town Maine area, and I fully acknowledge that there are other canoe centers in the world, Peterborough, Fredericton, Canton, any number of others. Happy to talk about those sometime, but this is why canoes at Old Town, and just a slightly different angle on that. And the quick answer to the question is, well, Old Town got its name because people have been living there for about 10,000 years. So it's a fairly old town. And this is from the mid-1800s, and you can see they've been building bark canoes there for a few thousand years. And the reason that the Penobscots settled there is it's an exceptionally good fishing spot. That up here, the top of this frame, you can see there's a set of rapids where the ocean-going fish, the salmon, the shad, and such would come upriver to spawn, and it was very easy to catch them in these shallow, narrow sections. And so they were, normally a hunter-gatherer group is not able to collect in large numbers in one place the way they were here. And needless to say, they've been doing it for a long time. And of course, when the Europeans came along, they saw the falls and thought that that would be a great place to run sawmills. And so for the mid-1800s, this was the lumber capital of the world. That they made the second railroad in the United States, went from Old Town to Bangor, where they could load this lumber on seagoing ships, and built most of New York, Boston, Washington, most of the eastern seaboard was constructed of lumber from this area. And then, also in the mid-1800s, there was a huge canoe fad. Canoes were really popular, really big. And it was said, for example, and this is showing Nuremberg Park in Auburndale outside of Boston. It said on a busy weekend that you could walk from shore to shore without getting your feet wet, just by stepping from one canoe to the other, because there were so many there and they were so close together. And for comparison, if you think of the current popularity of golf and skiing combined, that's how big canoes were in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So, and of course, there were a number of companies in the Penobscot region that leapt up to feed this demand. Garish is generally credited as being one of the first, but of course he was quickly followed by Morris, Carlton, White, and many others. And in the midst of this hubbub, there was a man named George Gray, shown here on your left, was running a small hardware store in Old Town. And the story that I was told was that the gentleman here on the left, Alfred Wicked, came into his store one time looking for work. He said, well, what can you do? He said, I can build canoes. Well, of course, that was a pretty marketable skill in those days. And so he agreed to set him up behind the hardware store, building canoes. And he quickly brought in his brother, shown here on the right, who was Richard or Dick Wicked. And after a few years, he learned the business, and one of the Chestnut brothers came down to the factory and lured him away, and he ran Chestnut for many years. So they had quite a bit of canoeing experience in that family. And business exploded. There was huge demand. They bought an old shoe shop, painted Indian Old Town Canoe Company across the front of it, which they chose as their name. And they even got the contract to build a special canoe for the Baldwin-Ziegler Polar Expedition. And they wanted one that could be broken up into pieces so that it could be loaded on dog sleds and hauled across the ice. Well, they didn't get to the pole, so most people had never heard of that, but it appears that this canoe may have saved their tail because their ship became icebound and they had to escape to an outer island to be rescued, and it appears that they were using this canoe and others as a way to escape. And the Indian Old Town Canoe Company was not just a marketing trick. They, in fact, were employing many of the Penobscots there, including this gentleman, who is Joseph Ranco. Joseph Ranco was a master builder. As near as I can tell, he learned building bark canoes from his father, and he's one of the few, if not the only, who made the transition from building bark canoes to building canvas canoes. And he's shown in his native regalia here on the right, and on the left, he's leaning on the railing, the steps of the canoe company. Now, they organized and named the company in the late 1900, around December. They ran for a year as Indian Old Town, and then they connected up with John Robertson, who was originally from the Peterborough area, had worked with Rushton in Canton, and was at this stage running his own livery in the Boston area. And so they reincorporated as the Robertson Old Town Canoe Company. Well, I don't think they actually painted his name on the front of the building. This is from the catalog. And if you look closely at the Robertson letters and the perspective on the rest of the letters, I think they just airbrushed the photo to put his name in. And for whatever reason, it didn't work out, and a year later, they changed the name again to just be the Old Town Canoe Company, and they repainted the front of the factory to be Old Town Canoe CO, so it was still more or less centered on the building, but things were still booming. And as you can see, they were piling canoes out in front because they didn't have enough room to store them all inside. And then they all got together for a picture on the front steps. And so, looks like the original founders were George Gray, Herbert Gray, and George Richardson, who were there. But about 1905 era, Sam Gray was George's son, was about a year out of college, and he got together and took over and worked very closely with Pearlie Cunningham, who was a friend of his, and they took off and decided to see what they could do with the business. And they built some really big canoes. The 34-footer here, looks like it, again, around 1905 was the first one that they pushed out the door. And the build records for some of those early ones exist. They show Joseph Franco's name on them and Alfred Wickett. They had a lot of time into them. And they built some very small canoes, like this one and some of the ones shown on the table here. And the auctioneers today love to call these salesman's samples. And I think that's a bit of a misnomer. I can't find any evidence that they were actually used as samples by salesmen. They were more commonly a dealer incentive, so that if you bought a complete railroad car full of canoes, which depending on the mix of canoes was 40 to 50 canoes, you got one 4-foot sample. If you bought 2 railroad cars, you got your choice of either an 8-foot model or 2 4-foot models. And judging by the numbers that have turned up, they seem to have been pretty popular. Most of them look like they got used pretty hard as kids' toys. They're often in pretty rough shape. But this solved one major problem for Old Town and their customers, which was that shipping by rail, an individual canoe packed in hay and burlap, often arrived damaged. They get dropped, they get things stacked on them, they chafe. Whereas if you could load a complete railroad car and close the door, you were pretty well guaranteed that it was going to arrive intact without any damage. And then you didn't have to go through the whole hassle of getting the railroad to return the canoe, getting another one to send out to them, and all of that. So there were some real advantages to getting this. Of course, on the other end, if you were a small sporting good store and you suddenly got a load of 50 canoes, you typically had a storage problem. And so they would see examples like this. Of course, they would, canoes were popular and they could find other ways to deal with it, but you can imagine a small mom and pop sporting goods store suddenly dealing with 50 canoes at once. And life went on, and then in March of 1910, Sam bought the Carleton Canoe Company, one of his larger competitors, and he got the whole thing. Carleton was not just a canoe company. The thing that Sam was really interested in is it was also a sawmill. And this was a classic case of vertical integration, because this meant now that he could secure his source of supply for white cedar ribs, for hardwoods, for the thwarts and seats and trim, and didn't have to worry about supply issues, because when you run out of wood in the canoe business, it's a bad day. And they continued to expand, and in 1920 they put this picture inside their catalog, claiming a continuous length of 570 feet, total floor space, 150,000 square feet. And this, of course, is an artist's conception, and like many artist conceptions, it's probably a little more optimistic than the real picture where it's squeezed in between the coal yard and the fire station, but it's still a pretty big building, and it was, and claimed to be the largest canoe factory in the world at the time. But things go on, markets change, tastes change, and so by the mid-20s, there were two things that had pretty significantly influenced the canoe business. One, as you can see in the center here, is that the outboard motor was making big demand for boats. So canoes with transoms, small boats, were a very hot thing. And as indicated in the background, the automobile was also having a big impact. Because in the early days of canoeing, you did most of your paddling at a canoe club. And a canoe club typically had a couple of dock boys who could help you carry the canoe up into the boathouse or down into the water. Or if you went on a camping trip, the sport was commuting with nature or hunting or fishing or something. And the guides were the ones carrying the canoes over the portages and carries. And when the car came in, suddenly the sports are carrying their own canoes. And now small, light canoes became a really big deal. And so all manufacturers came up with them. And as the 20s moved on, they also finally got the engines big enough to the point where they could actually make boats plane. And that was a whole new experience to move from displacement hulls to planing hulls. They did a lot with the steps to try to break the surface tension, get them up on a plane faster. And even racing boats, there's amusing, one of these is in the storage room at the Adirondack Experience, the former Adirondack Museum, and it's brand new. As near as I can tell, it's hardly been used. The story behind it is that the owner bought it, took it out once, and was scared so much at the speed of this boat that he never used it again. So it's kind of interesting to see a few untouched originals that are here, or still around. They also experimented with kayaks. Believe it or not, in the late 30s, early 40s, kayaks were a real big thing. So they had this insert in the 1940 catalog. They were a little ahead of their time. It didn't quite catch on at that stage. But the thing that did catch on were lap straight motorboats. These were the boats of the common man. I mean, yes, there were the mahogany runabouts and all the rest, but for most people, small lap straights were the way to go. And if you happen to have one, or an old town canoe, the build records for all of these have been preserved, and they've been scanned. And so you can see here that this is a lap straight outboard, 15 feet long, that shipped in 1953. And on the back side, it actually came back for repairs in 1954 and was shipped out to Houlton, Maine in 1955. So there's a fair amount of information you can get. And so if you can find a serial number on an old town boat or canoe, then often, and it was fairly recent, or excuse me, it was before 1985, there's a good chance we can get some more information for you. And of course, over time, the boats got fancier. They got windshields, they got steering wheels. I understand there are a couple of C models here that are on display. I haven't had a chance to go look at them yet. And of course, the lap strakes. Lap strakes came in all kinds of colors. They even had rainbow boats, as shown the one closest to me, where you started with a solid color and you kept adding a little more white until you got to a much lighter version on the bottom. And inboard outboards arrived, the boats got bigger, and by the early 60s, wooden boats were a huge business. That was where the market was going. And in the space of a year or two, it evaporated. Suddenly, fiberglass was the thing to have, and nobody wanted a wooden boat anymore. I understand that's when this institution got its start in a lot of the museums, because people were just giving away these old wooden boats. Everybody wanted fiberglass. Old Town responded. They worked with Bob King from White Canoe to get them started in this, which is a 24-foot fiberglass model, and they had a full line of boats. And they still kept canoes. You could still sail canoes, and there are a few of those here in the collection, or one of those here in the collection you can look at. And there was never any question when you saw this color pattern what era it was from. That was the style in those days. And they also worked with Bart Hathaway to do kayaks, and mostly whitewater kayaks. This again was kind of ahead of its time, and people weren't really ready for recreational kayaks. But then in 1973, the world changed suddenly. The Arab oil embargo completely killed the boat market. You couldn't give away a wooden boat or a fiberglass boat or any other boat at that point. Everybody wanted to go back to nature in human-powered craft. And fortunately, Old Town still had them and was making them, and so it became a very popular thing, and their business boomed, as did all the canoe and small boat makers in the mid-70s then. And then, 1974, Sam Johnson of Johnson Wax came along and decided that he'd like to buy the company. And after some negotiation, they came to an agreement, and not much really changed. It still kept the same people involved and ran it the same way, but it became part of a conglomerate of Johnson's. He put together a number of recreational companies. And if you were into paddling at that time, in the mid-70s, you probably saw an advertisement like this at some point or another. They said, when we threw a tripper off the factory roof, we learned two things. One, it won't fly, and two, it's the toughest canoe we've ever made. And there's a story actually behind. If you look at those four pictures across the top very closely, you notice that the shadow lines are slightly different on the windows, because it actually turns out to be quite difficult to throw a canoe off a 4-story building and get it to land on end. So they spent the better part of an afternoon taking pictures, hauling it up, throwing it off, making it land the wrong way. And then finally, they got it to land on end the way they wanted, and so they got the third picture over of it buckling. But when they came to put together the advertisement, they said, well, let's get the best throwing picture, the best falling picture. They're not all the same drop. But it was an exceptionally popular canoe by any definition. And then by 2000, the kayaking market had really started to take off. As you can see here, they're canoes still, but they're kind of fading into the background in the small picture, and the big kayak in the bottom is the focus. And today they've moved into the kayak fishing market in a big way. One of the other companies in their conglomerate is Maine Motors, and so they have the motor market, they have Johnson Reels, they have a number of things they're working together on. And the market continues to change. There are going to continue to be updates, but I think they deserve some credit, as Dan pointed out recently, that they're probably one of the oldest small boat builders. I did look up last night that Hodgkin Yachts in Booth Bay Harbor started in 1816, so I think they have a longer run as a boat builder. But at least in the small boat range, they're still here, and hopefully will be for a long time. So, without further ado, are there any questions? So, sure.
Once again, the year they began?
The company claims 1898.
Okay.
They claim that because in 1997, the marketing manager, Steve Kramer, knew that there was going to be a lot of hubbub at 2000, and since they had been claiming 1900 as their anniversary prior to then, he really wanted to get it a little earlier. And so my uncle, who was the oldest member of the generation, he was born in 1912, and so he happened to be in the factory one day, and Steve said, do you think they might have made a few canoes before they incorporated and got started? And he said, well, sure, it's possible. Presto, 1898 came the date. I've not found any documentary evidence from that period, and I've looked, I really have, to try and nail that down. So they're still claiming 1898, it's still possible. I just can't find anything, and I have found a couple of cases where people in 1915 and in 1923 wrote down 1900 as the starting date. So, which is a very roundabout way of saying it's a little fuzzy. So, you got a question?
Yeah, actually I have a couple.
Okay.
First of all, are replacement parts for wooden canoes available?
Yes. Jerry Stelmach in Island Falls Canoe in Atkinson, Maine has taken over the building of wooden canoes for Old Town under contract with them, and they are building parts. Now again, depending on how you define, some of the things may not be available. For example, the forms for an HW are no longer available, so if you have an HW model and you want the 5th rib back, you may not be able to get that exact one, but they do have a lot of the original forms. They are offering flanking rails and most of the things. The other thing I've heard recently is that they're running low on the diamond head bolts, and so those had been offered for for a long time. I don't believe they're currently being offered, but they do intend to bring them back in one way or another. So
Okay.
yes, parts are available.
All right, second question, I have an unrestored canvas-less Old Town, 18-foot Old Town from approximately 1926 out on display.
Yep, looks great. I saw
And
it.
there is, no, it looks like firewood. It looks like firewood compared to those beauties. But there is some kind of script writing on the bottom, right on the wood.
Okay.
I think one part of it says Old Town, and nobody's been able to decipher the other part. I'm hoping I can get you to take a look.
Sure, happy to take a look at it. There, people would write on, restorers today will often write on the inside of the, around the planking under the canvas. Certainly people at the factory would do things, either just as a goof or, you know, classic sort of Kilroy was here type thing. So I'm happy to take a look at it, but you can't always decipher it.
It's not unknown, you've seen it before.
There are other examples of that.
Because I wonder, you know, with the canvas on, nobody ever see it.
Right, you'll never see it. It's only the restorer is ever going to see that. But canvas typically only lasts about 25 years in normal use. I mean, more or less.
Okay.
And so canvas is it's a sacrificial element. It's going to be regularly replaced. So someone who is someone who was writing on the planking knew that probably in about 20 years someone else was going to see that. And if it came back to the factory and they were still there, they might see it. So.
Okay, for what it's worth, I believe this is around 1926. My mother bought it.
Yep.
And it was delivered by rail to Chameau, which is 15 miles from here.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't there, obviously, but it came in one. I never heard that it came damaged, so apparently they were lucky.
Oh, yeah, no, they didn't all get damaged. It's just was frequently that was a frustration. And needless to say, it was a frustration for the customer, it was a frustration for the rail, frustration for the factory to try and get another one to ship out to replacement. There were lots of reasons why they wanted to try to avoid that. But they did ship a lot individually. And they would wrap them, as you saw in that picture, they'd wrap them in hay and burlap and away they go. So,
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome. Sure.
Alden designed some sailing canoes, and Old Town built them in the mid-late 30s.
1931.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you know approximately how many were made?
I've not looked it up, and it gets there was a special Alden sailing boat that they made. First one was 1931. They actually shipped it back to John Alden to test and sail, and then they shipped it back, and it was used in the family for many years, and it's now with a collector out west. But and they had a bunch of those that they made. He also designed several sailing dinghies for them, and so whether you could call the sailing dinghy that was available up through the 60s one of his designs or not, I'd have to go check. His designs, as you probably know, are available from MIT, and you can get those. He also designed a very interesting twin sail racing boat, like a 1630, and I can't find any evidence that they've ever built them. I think, Dan, you still have the plans for it, don't you? I got the plans, they looked like they were fun. And so yes, he did a number of designs. I've not actually looked up how many, but they made quite a few over the years. And it was interesting because you look at the centerboard sailing canoes that they made in the 20s, many of them are not really well balanced. I mean, these were canoe people, they were not sail people. And so I think John Alden was to work with him was an acknowledgement that they needed to get somebody who understood this stuff to work with them to get some better designs. And I had an aunt who lived well past 100, and I would, as I was researching old canoe stuff, I would periodically ask her things. And commonly her answer was, well, that was well before my time. She was born in 1916, and I'm asking her things about 1902. It's not really fair. But I was excited when I started researching the Alden records, and so I mentioned that to her and asked if she did. She says, "Oh yes, I remember when Mr. Alden came to stay." He apparently stayed at the house. So.
Is that original Alden by chance in San Diego on a wood?
No, it's in Reno, Nevada.
Oh, Reno, Nevada. Okay.
Yeah, there's a collector there who has it.
All right.
So it's actually been fiberglassed and it's in pretty rough shape. So, but at any rate, it was kind of interesting because you can see the plans, the Alden plans, because there's several different pages and they're dated. and you can also get the build record for the boat, and they give the build records. Well, the dates line up. And they didn't have fax machines in those days, but they did have overnight rail, and so it appears that, you know, he designed the layout for the centerboard trunk, for example, and put them on the overnight rail. They'd show up in Old Town, and then they'd build it, and then you know, they just continue to go back and forth. So it's an interesting one.
Oh my God.
So, all right, yes.
What happened to the HW forms?
As far as I know, they got burned.
Oh.
They had, of course, the HW was removed from the catalog in the 50s, in the mid 50s, and not all of them they were building a lot of low-end HWs in 16-foot length, and that was when the 16-foot guide model was introduced. And I haven't chased this down, but I have a sneaking feeling that the 16-foot guide is actually a low-end HW, and so they would recycle forms, but typically forms wore out, or they just weren't selling them anymore. And they hung on to them for a long time, but you know, eventually they ran out of space. My understanding is that the crew that took an old form to the dump were instructed to wait while it burned, because they didn't want somebody hauling it out and fixing it and going into competition with them. So it was an easy day for the, you know, for the dump. But they, as far as I know, those were typically burned when they were done. So, anything else?
I've got an old town camper, it's called the camper model,
Yep.
and I assume this is a marketing strategy, so what are some of the other identities that the canoe can have?
Oh, they have all kinds of different names, and the names changed. I mean, for example, the 50-pound model became the lightweight model in canvas, the trapper in fiberglass, and the featherweight in Dacron. The only one that, the trapper was the most popular name, so that name is carried on, and that's now available in either canvas or fiberglass. There are lots of them that names changed, names come and go. I mean, they would pick different names as they went along. But I don't know, the camper was actually a pretty popular one. I think that was pretty consistent in the design. But there, you could make a very complex chart of how things progressed through those.
The guy that sailed across the Atlantic in a little old town.
Yep, Tinkerbell.
Tinkerbell.
Yep.
What model was that? I can't remember.
That was a white cap. It was a lap straight sailing white cap, which was probably based on one of the Alden designs, although in lap straight, not in wood canvas. And Man Ray, I think, right.
From Cleveland.
Yeah, from Cleveland. He was a copy editor at Cleveland Plain Dealer. And he said, yeah, he put in at Falmouth, Massachusetts, and sailed to Falmouth, England. Solo. So, but yes, that was a fun little boat, and he'd done quite a bit with that boat. It's an interesting read. If you tripped over. Well, I won't keep. Oh, sure.
One more comment. I have a 1926 heavy water 17-footer.
Yep.
And I have the build records.
Excellent.
They go that far back.
Oh yeah. Now the build records go back to about October of 1905, and so there are a few. Actually, Jim has one. I have one. There are a few on the out on display that predate the build records, but not that many. And yes, pretty much from 1905 up until about the mid 90s, there are about 500,000 build records. About half of those, roughly 250,000, which takes you up into about 1984, 85 time frame, have been scanned, which is why people can look them up and get them. And yes, it's sort of genealogy for canoes. It's kind of an interesting. It's pretty wild. You can start celebrating another birthday. You know?
3 more years and she's 100.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Have you heard of an Old Town Ranger?
Ranger. Yep. That's a wood trim on a tripper
On
hull.
a tripper.
Right.
And have you heard the story of the tripper that a Scottish flying service?
Yes, into the
Yeah,
bog.
okay.
Came off the wing of a seaplane, went into a bog, and was recovered and continued to be used.
Yeah.
So that'll give you an idea of the durability of. I don't recommend that. But so, well, thank you very much. If you have other questions, I can.
Thank you.